I want to talk about another side note. Dr. Lesson's book, If You Let It, will totally change your understanding of Old Testament biblical history. Now remember, folks, I have a master's degree in biblical studies, and I know my Bible very well. I'm not a Bible scholar, but I can be considered a Bible expert. And this book has changed my view of the Old Testament for me, and where it now finally makes sense to me. If you were like me, you would read through the Bible, and I had spent 25 years of my life in evangelical Christianity, and we were always taught that the Bible was the inspired Word of God. And I would read through it, but I'd go through my steps of cognitive dissonance because I'd come across and I'd read in the Old Testament, predominantly the book of Genesis, about where there is this God, Yahweh, was basically a schizophrenic God. Because on one hand, he was loving and compassionate, and on the other hand, he was murdering, telling his people to go out and to kill and to bloodily wipe out every man, woman, and child around, to literally wipe them off the face of the planet, and to kill everything. He was a bloodthirsty, powerful military ruler, Yahweh was. We can't deny it because it's there in black and white in the Bible. Now, and I had real problems with that. But because of what I was taught and wanting to trust what the people had taught me, I would go through my cognitive dissonance and I'd read it and just kind of let it go over and then go find something good. That's what a lot of us have done. Well, in the Old Testament, there are a few primary words for God: Yahweh, Adonai, and Elohim. And because most of the older biblical scholars did not have the new archaeological history, they applied these names as deity. Now remember, the Sumerian tablets that have been discovered in the last 30 and 40 years, that they are a couple thousand years older than the Bible. And they are showing the true origination of these names. Now, Anunnaki, An meaning sky, literally means the gods that came from the sky. And Anu was their chief leader. And he had two sons, Enlil and Enki. And they were the ones that came to earth and became the dominant leaders here on earth. And here's what we're finding in the Sumerian tablets over and over and over and over again. And these tablets are thousands of years older than the Bible. Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, of the early part, he is Enlil. And Adonai, he is Enki. That kind of throws a little curve at you, doesn't it, there? But when I began to read through predominantly what is called the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and I look at that biblical history, and I can then understand that Yahweh was not the God of heaven, but basically was an Anunnaki ruler God that was schizophrenic, all of a sudden it all begins to make sense to me. I remember talking with Dr. Lesson. And I said, so you're telling me this is what you've seen in your research and understanding who these are and how all this fits in. And I said, one of the things we always struggled with the most is we could, as biblical scholars and Bible students, we couldn't really get a firm understanding of who wrote the Old Testament, predominantly the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And they would basically tell us, well, we think it was always Moses that wrote that. They had no idea because there was no indication. And I asked Dr. Lesson about it. And he says, I can tell you what the Sumerian tablets say. The Bible, the first part of the Bible, was predominantly written by King Nebuchadnezzar and Marduk, the son of Enki, one of the Anunnaki rulers. Marduk, king of the earth, the book that Dr. Lesson talked about. They wrote it. And the Old Testament is basically the history of the ancient Jewish, Israeli race and their relationship to Yahweh is where it comes from. Now, if you're like me, having come out of years of background of evangelical Christianity, that kind of blows you away. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance that I had to work through to go through that. But when I was willing to accept it and willing to read that, all of a sudden, it made sense. My Bible made sense to me. And then I had to really readjust that the Bible was, to me, was not the authoritative Word of God. That's what we were taught. That's what we were told, because that's what the people of that age and time assumed, because we didn't have anything else. We didn't have any solid archaeological history. But we always go through the challenge of what we've been taught through our religious leaders, our religious institutions, and our religious practitioners. And then when hard physical evidence comes up contrary to that, we always go through a process of our cognitive dissonance. For hundreds of years, the power of the Catholic Church had taught that basically the Earth was the center of our galaxy. And when Copernicus and Newton came and said, no, the sun is the center, it took the Catholic Church over 300 years before they finally made an official statement of admitting that was right. Now, they were willing to accept it, but you notice they didn't officially make the change, because it totally changed their concept of religious power and control when they began to realize and had to make the official statement that the Earth was not the center of the galaxy. Now, the third name, the Hebrew name, Elohim. Elohim, when you look through other historical documents, are the master creator race referred to in the Bible in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But when you get the Hebrew name and word for God, it really should say, in the beginning, the Elohim created the heavens and the earth. Now that's another whole story I don't have time to get into, but it's all based around what we're starting to find in our new scientific evidence, is that how human consciousness is what creates everything that goes on around us. And this all started with the Elohim. They were what was called the master creator race, that all of the humanoid races come out after that. Now there's a reason why I say this, because remember, Enlil and Enki are the two primary sons of Anu, but they have different mothers, and it's reflected in this influence. Enlil, who was Yahweh, who was the bad cop god of the Bible in the Old Testament, both his mother and father were Anunnaki. And then you have Enki, who was the white hat, the good cop of the Anunnaki in the Bible. His mother was an Elohim, while Anu was his father. So really you see Enlil and Enki, that they're not full-blooded brothers. They're kind of stepbrothers because they both have different mothers. And you'll see the significance of that coming up later. The Anunnaki came to Earth to mine the gold and created us, the Homo sapiens, gave us these Homo sapien bodies to be their slaves. And most of them have left, but their influence over world leaders and influencers is still here on Earth. They bred with the humans and created this hybrid race called the Nephilim. And they're quoted in the Bible in Genesis 6:2 and also later in the book of Deuteronomy. The Nephilim, they're still here amongst us. Now, most of the history of the Anunnaki is being presented, as I said, in a dark light. But we're now learning that the good ones are using their influence to help heal the earth and as us as the human race. When I was with Dr. Lesson, I asked him the question, so are there still Anunnaki that are still here alive and still on earth? And he says, oh yeah. Are there people that are meeting with them? And he says, oh yeah. And he says, can you tell me and introduce me to them? And he did. And he introduced me to this man that is now a good friend of mine, Michael Lee Hill. And Michael is also stepping into some very interesting history, because he is also showing how the second bloodline of the Anunnaki in their history is being discovered in the Native Americans. Now, I want to introduce you to Michael Lee Hill. Michael is a true Nephilim and a Native American of the Iroquois tribe. Michael's an interesting guy. We just really hit it right off when we met and we started talking about all this. And he'll let you know that 10 years ago, he didn't even know what an Anunnaki was. Well, Michael lived in the suburbs of Cleveland, only about 4 blocks off the shore of Lake Erie. And he would go down to the lake late at night. And he noticed that these UFOs would start showing up. And this was no casual thing. Almost every time he would go down there, they would show up. And he had this feeling that they're showing up just for me. Well, he realized, I guess I better get my video camera. And almost every single time he would go down to the lake at Shore Uri after dark, they would show up and he would get them on video. He has this extensive UFO library. The word got out. He ended up being on the local news. It went to the national news. Fox did a short segment on him. And the next thing you know, he's got the History Channel knocking on his door. And they're basically saying, we're doing a study about ETs and UFOs, basically around here. And we're going to do a story on it. And we hear that you have one of the most extensive UFO libraries of anybody in the world. And he says, I don't know about that. All I know is I got a lot. Well, he said, there's this other young man that we're talking with, and he has much of the same stories that you have, and some of his videos are very, very similar to yours. Now, he had a blood anomaly. He was in the Marines, and he had to be discharged because he had this huge blood anomaly. We would like to have him and you, we would like to have your blood tested, if that would be okay. And he said, sure. So they sent both of them back to Harvard in Boston to have their blood tested by the best Harvard medical professors. His blood was tested. The doctor comes out, and Michael says, well, what is it? And the doctor says, dude, all I know is your blood isn't human. We have no way to classify your blood. We have 37 different types and subtypes of classifications that we can put blood into, and you don't fit any of them. That's all we have to say, and I don't know anything else about that. He went on to explain what it was, is that as humans, inside our blood, we have this enzyme called creatine kinase. And on average, we as humans have between 20 and 25 parts per liter of blood. Michael has around 2,500. What that means is he has this ability to take in and carry an extremely high amount of oxygen in his blood, which also means he can carry an extremely high amount of energy in his whole body and in his being. I use this as an illustration. If a police officer comes up with a taser gun and hits any of us and shoots us with the taser, we're going down. Michael, he just feels a tingling. Is all that he feels. Michael has an interesting history, because when he found this out, he had a friend that said, you need to go find your birth mother and found out really what happened with you. And he did. And she shared the story with him. Yeah, it's true. You're basically a hybrid out of what you'd come out of in this situation. Now, that's another whole issue. I'm not going to go into the details around it. But with that, it also led him to do some more history research of his genealogical background. And it was there that he discovered that he was an Iroquois Native American of that lineage line as well. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, what's happening now is they're starting to do the historical research in this great Ohio Valley region of what are called these serpent mounds. For decades, they've basically ignored them. But what they had come to have to admit that these serpent mounds were built by Native Americans in the area. It would be a mound of dirt that would be 6 to 8 feet high, and it was massively rounded and then shaped like a serpent. And there were some really interesting things that they were developing, because they started doing some archaeological digs in these serpent mounds, and they were discovering some really old archaeological history items. They also had that the dimensions of most of these mounds carried very similar dimensions to the ancient pyramids in Egypt. But there was one that had this significant historical item. They found this slab about yay big, a black granite slab, that the granite is nowhere, anywhere in that area, so it had to be brought there. And on this black granite slab, it had all these etchings. They did a date testing on it, and they found that the slab was about 3,000 years old. And they said, okay, we don't understand what it is, so they took it and put it basically into the basement of a museum, because they didn't quite understand it. But there was this one researcher and scholar that had heard about it. He asked to see it. So he went in, he was able to get it, he pulled it up, he looked at it, turned it over, And this was an ancient scholar that could read ancient Hebrew. And he noticed the etchings were all ancient Hebrew writing, is what they were. And you want to know what was on there? The Ten Commandments, just as it had come down from Moses off of Mount Sinai in ancient Egypt. What is the Ten Commandments being etched in ancient Hebrew on a piece of black granite slab that's 3,000 years old? What's it doing in the Ohio Valley region? Well, here's what's interesting. As Michael has developed a relationship with a lot of the ancient Iroquois historians. And if you understand their history, now, let me stop and take a second step at this also. Not only is Michael a part of the Iroquois, he also noticed that the Iroquois have this very, very rare DNA. It's called haplogroup H2A X, I think is what it is. It's a very, very rare DNA, and it's only found 2 places here on Earth in the bodies, the bones, the grave sites as they bring them up. It's in the Iroquois and other ancient Native Americans in the Ohio Valley region. And you want to know the other place that it's found? The northern Sea of Galilee in Israel. What does that tell us? That the Iroquois Indians and the Native Americans there are descendants going all the way back 3,000 and 4,000 years to the ancient Israelites of that northern Sea of Galilee region. What had happened is there was a group of them that left the area around Israel. And this was the time of the rumors that were coming of the ancient deluge, the ancient Noah's flood. They left the region, got on their boats, went across the Atlantic, and they settled in Central America. And they settled with the Mayans. And they stayed with the Mayans. Now the archaeological history will show you that there's absolute proof and evidence of the ancient biblical flood, what they call the deluge. It appears in history all around the world. But for those that were safe, that didn't die from the flood, if they were at elevations of 6,000 feet and higher. Well, the Mayans stayed in the high mountain regions of Central America. And so those that had come from Israel, i.e. the ancient Iroquois, they were there with the Mayans as well. After a period of time, they left the Mayans and they started migrating north until they hit Lake Erie. And they couldn't go anymore. So what you see is the ancient Iroquois are descendants of the ancient Israelites, who are the descendants of the original Nephilim, who are the descendants of the Anunnaki. And here we're seeing the 2 lines, the 2 bloodlines, and we're seeing that a lot of the really older Native American tribes of the northeastern United States, they can trace their lineage and their DNA all the way back to being descendants of the Anunnaki. Now, when Michael had discovered this, he was contacted by this gentleman. His name was A.R. Borden. Borden was considered to be probably the brightest and smartest scientist in the world at that time. He knew what was going on with Michael. He knew that Michael was not just a normal guy, and he needed to understand what was going on. Borden developed a relationship with Michael, and Borden, for the last 5 years of his life, basically tutored Michael. Now, here's the issue with A.R. Borden. A.R. Borden headed up an organization called the ACIO, the Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization. This was a clandestine operation of the NSA. They were the scientists that basically were the government arm that did all the research around ETs, downed ET spacecraft, reversed engineers the UFOs that they came in contact with, and had developed an ongoing relationship with an Anunnaki subgroup called the Cordium. The Cordium were the benevolent ones. They were the ones that were here to help us through this process. And for over 30 years, Borden worked with the Cordium. The Cordium were the advanced ones. The Cordium brought us a lot of stuff that we are not aware of today. Almost all of our advanced computer technology that we have today had come from the Cordium. They gave it to Borden, and Borden leaked it out to its sources that history told us where it had come from. Borden was never able to really go public with the things that he said. His group, they were so far advanced in their research that they were 50 to 100 years ahead of anything that was going on that we would know in scientific research today. He told this once to Michael. He basically said, everything that you saw on Star Trek 30 years ago, we do it all for real. We do the real beam me up, Scotty. We understand the physics behind how all the energy works. We understand because that the world, from a quantum science position, this world is not physical. It's just based on energy, and the physicalness is an illusionary concept to us. Because we understand that it's not physical, we can work with it, and we understand how it all works. So we understand how they can take a human body, put it into an energy state, and then transfer that energy to somewhere else. It can actually teleport the body. And then when it gets there, they reduce the energy, and boom, the body appears somewhere else. The teleporting, the beam me up, Scotty. They were also the best in the world and could do true time travel, because they understood what Einstein said, that there is no such thing as time. Time is irrelevant. All things are happening, past, present, and future, simultaneously right now. Because of that, they could teleport their bodies into another place in the time spectrum. You see, they viewed time as being vertical, not linear from item to item. And they understood the physics behind that. So they were the best time travelers in the world. They were the best teleporters in the world. They were the best remote viewers in the world. And they also had the ability to do what is called LERM, Light Encoded Reality Matrix, LERM. It's an acronym. The LERM process was they understood the power of human consciousness, and when you basically integrate it and encoded it with light, and you had a template of an object that you were visualizing, they could make that object, boom, appear right in front of them out of nowhere. My understanding is there were 18 of them that were a part of his higher elite group, and they all could do LERM at will. That's the advancement of A.R. Borden. Now, you're going to hear a lot more of me outside of these workshops in the coming months and years about the issue of A.R. Borden and what he brought to us. A.R. Borden was never able to come out into the public. He was so far advanced, he would have been ridiculed and he would have been shut down. But what he did do, he wrote a bunch of essays and white papers. And in those essays and white papers, he gave them to Michael. And then Michael has given them to me. I have the vast majority of all of Borden's essays and white papers. And in the near future, I'm going to start teaching about the LERM process of where we go into this. Because when we go back to the very first part today in this workshop, I talked about the 5 stages that we as humans are going through over a process of a couple hundred years in our evolutionary process and our growth. And one of those stages is we will come to understand that the world that we live in is basically what I call a holographic illusion. It's a holonomic, quantum-based energy world. It's not physical. It's all based around energy. And with that, when you understand how that works, you then understand how items that we consider to be physical, how they come into existence. And what Borden calls it is MPO, Manifest Production Observership. That's another topic. I'm not going to get into that today. But what I also do, out of this issue with A.R. Borden, he had an associate called Dr. Jameson Neruda. And Neruda basically, because he felt Borden was too tight and scripted, and he was assisting in the development of the coming artificial intelligence world, Neruda had serious conflicts with that. Neruda was able to break away, and he gave these 5 interviews of what is coming up in our world over the next 40, 60 years, and the shifts and changes that we're going to go through. And Neruda does an excellent job of describing how the world, the basic root problem is separation consciousness, what I talked about in part 1. And he talks about what is it, how it creates our problems, and how we overcome that. Now, my understanding is when I talked with Michael, because see, Borden and Neruda had come to a separation and a conflict that was there. And what Michael had told me was, it was Neruda's breaking away that kind of woke Borden up, and he began to shift and change. And over the few following years from that, he made the shift to realize what really was going on. And that's when he started developing most of his white papers. And that's when he developed this organization called the Labyrinth Group and the Linkage Institute. Now, I will talk about those more later. This is not the purpose of this workshop here now, but how we get to start working on carrying out the intentions of what Borden had with his Linkage Institute. And that's where we get to start moving into being these, what I call these holonomic, quantum-based, earthly-based beings who have no limitation on what we can produce and what we can do. So A.R. Borden is a unique and very qualified figure that you're going to hear me talk about periodically. And also, I highly encourage you to read the Neruda interviews. You can go to the wingmakers.com website and the Neruda interviews are there. You can also go to my website, thesedonaconnection.com, and in the resources tab, I have all 5 of the interviews in PDF format. I would highly encourage you to read those. If you want to start moving forward, into this new holonomic quantum-based world, if you want to start letting go of our old Newtonian-based world, if you want to be where the cutting edge is where things are shifting and changing, then you're going to want to read the Neruda interviews. And not only that, I would encourage you to read the book Ancient Arrow Project. That is a novel based on the story of how Borden and Neruda came in to becoming in touch with all this equipment and everything that they had discovered that is based around the Wingmakers material. Now, in the Ancient Arrow Project, Neruda talks about his boss, who is 15, and he always uses the code name 15. A.R. Borden is 15. Okay, that's not even debatable. Borden had come out and did some radio interviews and admitted that, yes, he was. So, and it tells you the relationship they have, but there has been shifts and changes because those interviews were done 20 years ago. Neruda did 5 interviews. They were so significant and so important that they weren't all 5 released at the same time. The first 2 came out in 1998. 3 and 4 was held for 4 years. Interview number 5 was so advanced that they couldn't release it because the cabal would have basically came in and quashed it, shut it down, made it look like crazy historical people had written in this stuff. So they held it until they felt that we were ready to have it released and understand it. And that 5th interview was held for 16 years. It was just released 4 years ago. That's an interview that'll change your life, folks. It will change your life. In that interview, Neruda gives the background in the history of Anu, the king of the Anunnaki, the head of the Anunnaki, his role, his position, how he created this holographic world that we live in that's basically just this massive virtual reality illusion. They were the ones that created all this. And they took us, our spiritual beings, and stuck us inside what they call these human uniforms that put us into this prison. And we have remained prisoners inside these human uniforms for basically a couple 100,000 years. And we are now learning how to free ourselves. And Neruda's interview, especially the 5th interview, is very significant around that. So, that's the background. That's the history of the role of the Anunnaki, who they are, how they brought us to this place where they are, how they were the originators of the gold. And I'm going to get into more of that in the next part of it. But this is a good time to take a break. But in the next section, I'll start talking about who is the dragon family, why they had their gold, what is their relationship with the Anunnaki, and you'll begin to see the big picture about how all of this fits in together. So thank you very much. That's the end of this part, and we'll see you in the next part.